Emma cringed as her classmates snickered about her mother's boring job at the university library. "At least our parents have real careers," one said cruelly. But when the power went out during the foreign diplomat's visit, and panic spread through the building, her mother's calm voice cut through the chaos, speaking fluent Arabic to the confused delegation. "Welcome to Interesting Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden identity, courage, and the price of secrets, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe that true strength often hides in plain sight, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter." The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Columbia University's main library, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors where Margaret Chen moved quietly between the stacks. At 52, she had the kind of understated presence that made her nearly invisible to most students, just another middle-aged woman in sensible shoes, arranging books with methodical precision. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes practical and unremarkable. She spoke only when necessary, and even then in soft, measured tones that barely rose above a whisper. Emma Chen sat in the graduate lounge 3 floors above, surrounded by her international relations cohort, trying to ignore the familiar knot of embarrassment in her stomach as the conversation turned to family backgrounds. It was the same routine every semester, ambitious 20-somethings comparing their parents' impressive careers like trading cards. "My father just made partner at Goldman Sachs," announced Jessica, a blonde from Connecticut whose every sentence sounded like a press release. "He's been working on the merger with the European banks." "That's nothing," countered Marcus, adjusting his expensive glasses. "My mom's the cultural attaché to France. She's literally dining with ambassadors next week." One by one they went around the circle, fathers who were CEOs, mothers who were federal judges, parents who owned tech companies or served in Congress. The stakes kept rising with each revelation, and Emma felt herself shrinking further into her chair. "What about you, Emma?" The question came from David, a sharp-eyed student from D.C. whose father worked at the State Department. "You never talk about your family." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been dreading this moment all semester. "My mom works at the library," she said quietly, hoping they'd move on. The reaction was immediate. A few exchanged glances, barely suppressed smirks. Jessica actually laughed out loud. "The library," she repeated, as if Emma had said her mother was a circus performer. "Like checking out books and stuff?" "She's a librarian, yes," Emma replied, her voice smaller now. She didn't mention that her mother worked right here in their building, probably shelving books at this very moment while they mocked her. "Well, that's quaint," Marcus said with condescending sympathy. "I mean, someone has to do those jobs, right? Very noble work." The dismissal stung worse than outright cruelty. Emma forced a smile and mumbled something about studying, gathering her things to leave. As she stood, she heard David's voice behind her. "At least our parents have real careers that actually matter. I mean, what does a librarian even contribute to society? Anyone can organize books." The words followed Emma down the hallway like physical blows. She'd heard variations of this her entire life. The assumption that her mother was somehow less than other parents, that her quiet work was meaningless, that their family was ordinary in the worst possible way. What made it worse was that Emma had started to believe it herself. She found her mother in the foreign languages section as usual, carefully cataloging a new shipment of texts in what appeared to be several different scripts. Margaret looked up as Emma approached, immediately sensing her daughter's distress. "Rough day?" Margaret asked, setting down a book written in what Emma thought might be Cyrillic letters. Emma shrugged, not trusting herself to speak without crying. Her mother had a way of reading her emotions that was both comforting and slightly unnerving, like she could see straight through any pretense to the hurt underneath. They were talking about their parents again, Emma finally managed, about careers and accomplishments, and how important everyone is. Margaret was quiet for a moment, continuing to sort through the books. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Emma noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. "And you wished I was something else," her mother said softly. "It wasn't a question. Emma struggled to find words that wouldn't sound cruel. "I wish I had something impressive to say about you, something that would make them take me seriously." Her mother nodded slowly, understanding. "You think what I do isn't important." "That's not what I mean," Emma protested, but even as she said it, she realized it was exactly what she meant. In a world of power brokers and decision makers, what was organizing books? "Emma," her mother said gently, There's a lot about me you don't know, things I've never told you because they're not part of this life." Before Emma could ask what she meant, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. The sudden darkness was followed by confused voices echoing through the building. "Power outage," Margaret said calmly, already moving toward the main floor with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. "Probably affects the whole grid. Bad timing." "Bad timing for what?" Emma asked, following her mother through the maze of shelves. "The diplomatic reception," Margaret replied. "International delegation meeting with the university board today. Timing is everything in diplomacy." As they reached the main floor, Emma could see the problem immediately. Near the library's main entrance, a group of about 15 people in formal attire stood in obvious confusion. They were speaking rapidly in what sounded like multiple languages, their voices rising with frustration and concern. Emma recognized some of them as university officials, but the others were clearly foreign dignitaries of some kind. The translator didn't show up because of the subway delays, she heard Dean Morrison explaining to someone. "And now with the power out, we can't access the virtual interpretation service." The situation was deteriorating quickly. Emma could see the diplomatic guests growing more agitated, some pulling out phones that apparently had no signal. The university officials looked increasingly panicked, clearly out of their depth. That's when Emma heard her mother's voice, clear and confident, cutting through the chaos. "Assalamu alaikum, la taklaku, al-wadra tahta saitra." The effect was immediate and startling. The Arabic-speaking members of the delegation, 3 men in traditional dress, who had been talking animatedly among themselves, turned toward Margaret with visible relief. One of them, an older man with a carefully trimmed beard, responded in rapid Arabic. Emma stared in shock as her mother conversed fluently with the men, her entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the quiet librarian who whispered her way through the stacks. In her place stood someone who commanded attention, whose voice carried authority, and whose bearing suggested complete confidence in handling complex diplomatic situations. But Margaret wasn't finished. She turned to another group, what Emma now realized were Eastern European officials, and seamlessly switched to what sounded like Russian. "Не волнуйтесь, я могу объяснить ситуацию." The officials, who had been speaking in concerned whispers, turned to her with surprised gratitude. One woman, middle-aged with silver hair, stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in Russian. Margaret responded without hesitation, her accent flawless. Emma felt the world tilting around her. This couldn't be her mother, the woman who spent her days quietly shelving books, who never spoke above a whisper, who Emma had been embarrassed to claim as her own just minutes before. But Margaret still wasn't done. A third group, Asian diplomats who had been standing somewhat apart from the others, were addressed in what Emma thought was Mandarin, then what might have been Japanese, and finally in yet another language she couldn't identify. Within minutes, Margaret had organized the entire group. She was explaining the situation to each delegation in their native tongue, coordinating with university officials, and somehow managing to turn what had been a diplomatic disaster into a managed situation. Dean Morrison approached Margaret with obvious relief and not a little awe. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I had no idea you spoke. How many languages was that?" 8, Margaret replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes 9, depending on dialects." Emma felt her legs go weak. 8 languages. Her mother, her quiet, invisible, supposedly ordinary mother, spoke 8 languages fluently enough to handle diplomatic translation in a crisis. As the immediate crisis subsided and emergency generators restored partial power, Emma watched her mother continue to facilitate between the groups. She moved between Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, and languages Emma couldn't even identify, serving as the crucial link that kept international communications flowing. One of the Russian officials, the silver-haired woman, seemed particularly interested in Margaret. Emma couldn't understand their conversation, but she noticed the way the woman studied her mother's face, as if trying to place her. Finally, the woman asked something in Russian that made Margaret pause mid-sentence. For the first time since the crisis began, Emma saw uncertainty flicker across her mother's face. The Russian woman stepped closer and spoke again, more quietly this time. Emma caught only a few words that sounded like Moskva and what might have been a name. Margaret's response was swift and firm, but Emma noticed her mother's hands had started to shake slightly, something that never happened when she was organizing books. The diplomatic crisis was officially resolved within an hour.
The delegation was relocated to a conference room with backup power, proper lighting was restored, and the university's reputation for handling international affairs remained intact. But Emma remained in the main library, sitting at a table where she could watch her mother return to her seemingly mundane tasks. Margaret moved through the stacks with the same quiet efficiency as always, but Emma now saw it differently. The way her mother's eyes constantly scanned, not just for misplaced books, but for people, for movement, for anything out of place. The way she positioned herself so she could always see exits. The way she seemed to catalog everyone who entered and left the library. How had Emma never noticed these things before? As the afternoon wore on, students began filtering back into the library, as if nothing had happened. Within an hour, the diplomatic incident was just another story. Power outage, some confusion, crisis averted. Most people didn't even know there had been foreign diplomats in the building, but Emma knew, and she knew that without her mother, the situation could have been a genuine international incident. When the library closed that evening, Emma waited by the main entrance as her mother finished her closing duties. She had 100 questions, but she didn't know how to ask any of them. "You want to know about the languages?" Margaret said as they walked toward the subway together. "8 languages," Emma repeated. "You speak 8 languages, and you never told me." 9, actually. I was being modest earlier." They walked in silence for several blocks before Emma found her voice again. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "I mean really, who are you?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. In the streetlight, Emma could see something in her mother's eyes she'd never noticed before, a hardness that spoke of experiences far beyond organizing books. "I'm your mother," Margaret said simply. "Everything else is from before." "Before what?" Margaret looked around carefully, a habit Emma now realized wasn't just casual awareness but trained surveillance. "Before I became a librarian. Before I became someone safe and ordinary and invisible." She paused. "Before I became someone who could give you a normal life. But what were you before?" Margaret started walking again, slower this time. "I worked for the government, different agencies, different departments, places that don't officially exist, doing work that never happened." Emma felt her understanding of everything shift again. "You were a spy. I was many things. Translator, analyst, operative. I spent 15 years moving through countries most Americans can't find on a map, speaking languages most people have never heard of, gathering information that sometimes prevented wars and sometimes started them." They had reached the subway entrance, but neither moved to go down. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Emma asked. "Because that life requires you to be someone different every day. Someone who can disappear without a trace, who can become anyone she needs to be, who can never form attachments that might compromise the mission." Margaret's voice was steady, but Emma heard the undercurrent of old pain. "I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to have roots, stability, a mother who was just there." Emma thought about all the time she'd wished her mother was something more exciting, more impressive, more worthy of respect. "The Russian woman," Emma said. "She recognized you." Margaret nodded. "Katerina Volkov. We worked together in Prague years ago. Different sides, but the same objectives. She was trying to place where she knew me from. Could that be dangerous?" "It could be complicated," Margaret admitted, "but probably not dangerous. That was a long time ago, and we're both out of that life now." They descended into the subway, joining the evening commute crowd. Emma watched her mother navigate the turnstile and realized she was seeing everything through new eyes. The way Margaret positioned herself on the platform, always with her back to a wall. The way she scanned faces in the crowd, not obviously, but systematically. The way she chose their seats on the train, aisle access, view of exits. "Do you miss it?" Emma asked as the train pulled away from the station. "Sometimes," Margaret said honestly, "there was a clarity to that work. You always knew exactly what was at stake, exactly who you were fighting for or against. The library is quieter, but you chose the library, you chose this life." Margaret looked at her daughter, and for the first time Emma saw her mother not as someone who had settled for less, but as someone who had chosen something more difficult. "I chose you," Margaret said simply. "I chose being able to come home to the same person every day, to someone who would know me as just Margaret, not as whoever I needed to be for the mission." Emma felt tears starting to form. "I'm sorry I was ashamed of you." "You weren't ashamed of me," Margaret corrected gently. "You were ashamed of what you thought I was. There's a difference." The train pulled into their station, and they emerged into the evening air. As they walked the familiar route home, Emma found herself seeing everything differently, not just her mother, but herself, and what it meant to be ordinary or extraordinary. "Those students," Emma said finally,
The ones who were making fun of you being a librarian. What about them? They have no idea, do they? About what you've done, about what you're capable of." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile Emma had seen from her all day. "That's the point," she said. "The most dangerous people in the world are the ones you never see coming, the ones who look ordinary, who blend into the background, who seem harmless and forgettable." Emma thought about Jessica with her Goldman Sachs father, Marcus with his diplomatic attaché mother, David with his State Department connections. Suddenly their impressive family backgrounds seemed less meaningful than they had that afternoon. "Tomorrow," Emma said, "when they ask about my family again, what should I say?" "Tell them your mother works at the library," Margaret replied, "because that's the truth. Everything else is just details." They turned onto their quiet residential street, lined with modest homes and ordinary families living ordinary lives. Emma looked at her mother walking beside her, still the same woman who organized books and whispered her way through the stacks, but also someone who had once moved through shadows and secrets, who could speak to diplomats and diffuse international incidents, who had chosen to give up excitement and recognition for something more valuable. "Mom," Emma said as they reached their front door. "Yes, I think you're extraordinary." Margaret paused with her key in the lock. "No," she said quietly, "I'm exactly what I've always been. You just learned how to see it." Inside their small house, Margaret went through her evening routine, making tea, sorting through mail, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. Emma watched these familiar rituals with new understanding, seeing both the ordinary mother she'd always known and the extraordinary person who had chosen to become ordinary. Later that evening, as Emma sat at her desk trying to focus on homework, she heard her mother on the phone in the kitchen. The conversation was brief and conducted in what sounded like German, followed by another call in what might have been Arabic. When Emma came downstairs for water, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with several newspapers spread out, not local papers but international publications in multiple languages. "Keeping up with current events," Margaret explained, seeing Emma's questioning look. "Do you ever think about going back," Emma asked, "to that other life?" Margaret folded one of the newspapers carefully. "Every day," she admitted, "but then I think about what I have here, what I'd be giving up, and I remember why I chose this path." She looked up at Emma, and in that moment Emma understood something fundamental about sacrifice and love and what it meant to choose the person you wanted to be rather than the person you were trained to be. "Besides," Margaret added with a slight smile, "who says I've completely left that life behind? The library gets very interesting people sometimes. Researchers, academics, visiting scholars from all over the world. Amazing what you can learn just by listening, by being helpful, by being invisible." Emma stared at her mother, realizing there were layers to this revelation she was only beginning to understand. "You're still doing it," she said, "aren't you? Just differently." Margaret returned to her newspaper. "I'm a librarian," she said calmly. "I help people find information. Sometimes that information is more important than others realize." That night, Emma lay in bed thinking about identity and perception, about the difference between who someone appears to be and who they actually are. She thought about her classmates, so proud of their parents' obvious achievements, and wondered what secrets might be hidden in every ordinary life. She thought about her mother, who had chosen to be underestimated rather than celebrated, who found power in invisibility rather than recognition, and she realized that true strength wasn't always loud or obvious or impressive to strangers. Sometimes it was quiet and patient and willing to wait for the right moment to emerge. The next morning, Emma walked into the graduate lounge with her head held high. When the inevitable conversation about family backgrounds resumed, she listened to the familiar boasts and achievements with new perspective. "What about you, Emma?" David asked, the same mocking tone in his voice as the day before. "How's your mom's exciting library career?" Emma looked around the circle at her classmates, future diplomats and policymakers, so convinced of their own importance, so certain that influence could only be measured in titles and salaries and public recognition. "My mother," Emma said clearly, "is exactly where she needs to be, doing exactly what she's meant to do, and that's all that matters." The response wasn't what they expected. No shame, no apology, no attempt to make her mother's job sound more impressive than it was. Just quiet confidence that spoke of someone who had learned the difference between seeming important and being important. Jessica started to say something dismissive, but something in Emma's expression stopped her. There was a new quality to Emma's presence, an assurance that suggested she knew something they didn't. And she did.
She knew that real power often hid in plain sight, that the most dangerous people were the ones you underestimated, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage was choosing to be ordinary in a world obsessed with being extraordinary. Later that afternoon, Emma found her mother in the library's foreign language section, quietly cataloging new arrivals. She watched for a moment as Margaret worked, seeing both versions of her simultaneously, the invisible librarian and the international operative, the ordinary mother and the extraordinary woman who had chosen love over adventure. "Mom," Emma said softly. Margaret looked up, and in her eyes Emma saw all the stories that would never be told, all the missions that never officially happened, all the secrets that were kept safe in the quiet spaces between catalog numbers. "Thank you," Emma said. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are, all of it." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that held 15 years of secrets and 30 years of love, and went back to her books. But Emma noticed that as she worked, her mother's eyes never stopped moving, never stopped watching, never stopped protecting the world in ways that would never make headlines or earn recognition, and Emma thought that was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Some heroes never ask for applause. They work in whispers and shadows, keeping the world safe through silence rather than action. They choose to be underestimated rather than celebrated, to be ordinary rather than obviously extraordinary. They organize books, they raise daughters, they speak 9 languages when the world needs them to, and they fade back into invisibility when the crisis passes. They are our mothers, our neighbors, our quiet guardians, who know that the most important battles are fought not for glory, but for the simple right to come home to someone who knows your real name. Margaret Chen was a librarian. She was also so much more, but most importantly, she was exactly who she chose to be, and that choice made all the difference.